I could probably change the audio and see whether it still remains. I shouldn't have something on.
It's not a big deal.
Yeah.
Oh, that's better. Yeah, now I don't hear it at all. Oh, I don't hear you either, so that doesn't help.
Is this good?
Yep,
Okay.
perfect.
Or,
All right, Joshua, thanks for coming on. Appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
I am Joshua, a philosophy and theology student at the University of Oxford, and I run a channel, Philosophy for All, where I just introduce people to different aspects of philosophy of religion, existentialism, and also a bit of Russian existentialism, like Dostoevsky and the rest. So that's kind of what I do around the place as well.
Awesome. And so you wanted to talk about the problem of evil today.
Yes, indeed. I think it would be an interesting discussion to carry on from our last discussion on the problem of evil, but also to talk a bit about different areas like the logical problem of evil, evidential problem of evil, but also the external problem of evil, where I think we'll have quite a lot of disagreements as well.
Sure. Was there anything specifically you wanted to start on?
Well, perhaps we could start off with the internal problem of evil, because I guess there's the internal problem of evil, which says, okay, given the Christian worldview, how do we see whether it's internally coherent worldview? And then also the external problem of, well, all right, let's take a step back and look at evil as a whole and say, well, all right, how should we view evil? How should we view God? From an external perspective, does this make any sense at all? So perhaps we could start off with the internal problem of evil, and just to kind of figure out where we both stand on these issues. What do you think about the logical problem of evil? Do you think it works, or do you think the free will defense, I guess, responds to it successfully?
I definitely don't think the free will defense works for a number of reasons. Specifically, I don't think libertarian free will is coherent. So, like, you say there's a logical problem with a round square, and you said an objection is, but magical pixies. Well, that doesn't make any sense. It's not an objection. So, in the same sense, I don't think that the free will defense works because I don't think free will is a coherent thing in the libertarian sense, which is how most Christians apply it. To start off with the internal problem of evil, I think that you could make an argument that God would be evil by his own standards, given the rules and things he sets forth in the Bible, which he himself violates, and then he makes like exception clauses or something, like he's special or something, and so it doesn't apply to him. So there is definitely an argument you could make that God would be evil by the standard of the Bible itself as well. But I normally don't go that route because I am not Christian, so I would not make that argument typically.
That's a few areas that we can discuss. Though I guess the topic on the free will defense and you saying free will is not coherent, perhaps being more precise with that is your argument free will is not coherent? Is that free will is there is no possible world in which libertarian freedom makes sense? You think libertarian freedom is just completely impossible, or what is that argument for libertarian freedom being incoherent or impossible? What's the term there?
Well, I've just never heard a coherent model of libertarian free will. I don't think it's probably not possible. So, like, I like Sam Harris's argument that everything is either done for reasons or done for no reasons. If it's done for reasons, it's determined. If it's done for no reasons, it's random. And you can't add in a third variable of some kind to get freedomness. Even if you say that there is some kind of individual startership of some kind of decision, like from your soul or whatever, well, that decision is still going to be either done for reasons or done for no reasons. Either your soul has reasons, like you like certain things or you don't like certain things, and those reasons determine why you make the decision, or your soul is making a decision for no reasons, in which case it's random. And so it doesn't make a difference if you add in a third variable. You're still going to fall back on either it's done for reasons, in which case it's determined, or it's done for no reasons, in which case it's random. And so I don't see any logically possible way to get to some kind of self-caused choicey thing that isn't done for reasons or no reasons.
I think there's an interesting case to be made between reasons and whether you're being determined by your reasons. I guess there's a kind of causal question of whether your decision to act based on that reason precedes the existence of the reason itself, or whether you're going through those reasons and are slowly getting drawn towards conclusion. Because I suppose you could have one person with like 5 different arguments laid out in front of them, perhaps, and then they say, well, okay, the probability of one argument is better than the other, and then they slowly make that decision towards it based on their own epistemic judgments and whatnot of probability between them. To me, it would seem that although it is determined in some sense, directed by the arguments in front of them, that's not necessarily, I guess, an incoherent idea where someone has ability to choose between what arguments work better or not.
Oh, sure, I would agree, but I think that isn't actually addressing the argument. So, because the argument isn't about whether the reasons are the determining factor. The argument is, so you go from a state of no choice made to a state of choice made, and there has to be something that causes that shift in state from no choice made to choice made. And either that shift happened randomly, just some random fluctuation, or that shift was determined by something else. And those would be the reasons, presumably. And so if there were some reasons that determined the shift from you going from no choice made to choice made, then the decision was done for reasons. It doesn't matter if the reasons are arguments or chemical reactions, I don't care. But the point is that it doesn't seem logically possible to go from a state of no choice made to a state of choice made without there being some determining reasons prior to that. There doesn't seem to be a coherent way to explain how you can go from switch from those two states from some like independent cause thing. It doesn't make any sense. There has to be like predeterminate causes to lead to that state.
That's an interesting argument that you raised there. So you would say that, I guess, going from no choice to choice would either be determined by completely randomly, or what do you think is that movement which goes from no choice to choice?
Well, either it is going to be determined by some deterministic forces, or it's going to be random, or it's going to be a combination of both. But there's no way to add a freedomness to the decision. It can't be a free choice. It can't be like I forget what it's called, causa sui, comes from the individual self thing. Doesn't seem like that's logically possible. Either your self, whether it's a physical brain or a soul of some kind, is either going to be able to see some kind of decision going on and say, or see some kind of option going on and say, this option is, I'm going to make a decision here, which was caused by the previous reasons, like the arguments maybe, or I had moldy bread, moldy cheese, the Scrooge argument, whatever they were, those could have caused you to go from no reason or no choice to choice, or it was just random. There's nothing determined. It just happened to be the case that just randomly you went from no choice made to choice made. And there doesn't seem to be a third option. There doesn't seem to be a way to causa sui go from no choice to choice coherently.
But would you not say that most people who argue for free will are not arguing against the idea that there can exist some form of reason which guides the freedom or the decision of what the will is trying to choose? For example, I guess going back to the example of a sandwich or whatever it is, they have, all right, I have opportunity to eat a moldy sandwich in front of me. At least it seems logically possible for me to say, well, all right, I see a moldy sandwich in front of me. It seems bad to eat it. I have some reasons for why I think it's a bad idea to eat it, but then I'll still eat it anyways or decide not to. So the act of reason itself is not necessarily against the idea of reason, of free will per se, but just that it could be incorporated under what people generally, at least common sense, talk about the usage of free will itself. So free will includes the action of reason, but also includes the fact that there's no further antecedent conditions beforehand, which would then dictate one to must act in a certain way to follow that reason.
Well, again, that's not addressing the argument, because that's the straw man or a misinterpretation of the argument. Because the argument isn't there are reasons, like you can list philosophical arguments or whatever that could compel someone. That doesn't matter. That's irrelevant. The focus of this argument is somehow presumably, I'm a physicalist, naturalist, so I think everything's a brain. You have a brain. Your brain 5 seconds ago was in a state of not having made a choice, and now it's in a state of having made a choice. And from the physicalist perspective, what caused that was a physical change in your brain. It wasn't reasons, it wasn't logic. Arguments don't matter. You can look at an fMRI and know what decisions are going to make before they make it. It isn't based on the logic. There's a physical process in the brain going on that determines you're going to make a choice, and you have no control over it, essentially. And so that's the hard determinist view of how choices are made. There's a physical process in the brain, and it causes you to go from a state of choice or no choice to choice. You don't get a say in it whatsoever. Now, the other option is random quantum fluctuations happen and cause your brain to misfire, and then you've gone from no choice to choice made. Those are the two options, determined or random. Now, even if we add like a soul or some new substance, if that new substance has the same process of time t, it has no choice, time t equals 5, it has a choice made, you have the same problem. Either that choice was made because it was determined by some precedent causes, or it was done for no reason, that this state change occurred. And so when I say reason, I'm not talking about some kind of logical justification to motivate people. I don't care about that at all. I'm saying there was a set of physical dominoes or spiritual dominoes that caused this entity to go from a state of no choice to choice. And there's no way to undermine those series of dominoes without it just being random.
Well, I don't think there's anything logically impossible with your position. I think I'm not arguing necessarily against a physicalist or hard determinist position. What I am trying to demonstrate is at least that there is one possible world. And I guess this is the point of the free will defense, to say, well, it might not be a true world. It might not even be a practical world, or a probable or a plausible world for that matter, but just that there is one possible world in which the physicalist view is wrong, and that there is a world where it is logically possible for people to act based on reason and have that view of a soul looking on the body. And I guess that might be the heart of the disagreement between us, is that I'm not sure whether you're saying that world is logically impossible, incoherent, which seemed to be what you're saying at the start, or whether you're just saying, well, all right, in this world, reason or reason is purely the idea of chemical processes or whatever, which lead to our choices.
Well, yeah, so I'm arguing that the spiritual world is logically impossible or incoherent, one of those two. And the reason is because I can describe it from the perspective of the naturalist world. The way it works here, our decisions would be determined by physical processes in the brain or random. But let's suppose there is a spiritual world. There is actually a spirit there. The spirit, to go from a state of no choice to choice, is going to have the exact same problem. It doesn't matter how many new ontologies, spiritual, omni-natural, supernatural, doesn't matter what you add in. There's always going to be the same problem, no matter the ontology, that to go from a state of no choice made to a state of choice made, there has to be a set of dominoes, whether it's physical dominoes or spiritual dominoes or supernatural dominoes, that precede to cause or determine that choice, that state change, going from no choice made to choice made. And if there isn't a series of dominoes that determines that change, then that change must have been random. Those are the only two options. And it doesn't matter what ontology is. It's independent of physicalism, spiritualism, naturalism, doesn't make a difference. The only logically possible ways to go to a state change is either one, determined by prior state changes, or two, random. And there doesn't seem to be a third option that's even coherent for this free thing to be free. It's either going to be determined by outside forces that it has nothing to do with, the precedent dominoes, or it's going to be determined by randomness, which it has nothing to do with or no control over, in which case, neither way, it's ever going to be free.
But would you not say there's a difference between physical dominoes or physical processes or reasons and what someone might call spiritual processes, or the activation of the use of, I guess, philosophical reasoning and argumentation? And the reason why I think there is a way in which people have been able to present libertarian free will without being Christian or being metaphysical.
Oh, you froze. Did I freeze?
It seems like
you're back. You're back.
Yep. Okay, brilliant. So I was just saying that there's a lot of people who may not believe in a spiritual world at all, but still believe in libertarian free will. Now, I'm not saying that this is what I'm arguing for, but I'm saying that there is a point where reason seems to have a few different categories. There's the idea, as you present properly, of physical reasons. I have chemicals in my brain which make me act in a certain way. But there's also ideas of I'm responding, or I guess in a spiritual sense, which seems logically possible to me, of someone interacting with things in a philosophical, they're being, I guess, promoted, assumed by arguments. They're being, what's the correct word for it? They're being convinced by arguments or not. And I know that's somewhat separate from your idea of reason presented by, in a physicalist perspective, but I guess the very point of my criticism or my argument is to say, well, there is a separate world in which there's at least one possible world in which you could conceive of a situation where you just have no physical objects, entities at all, but just brains interacting with arguments and are coming to certain conclusions based on the movement of the arguments in front of them. It seems at least possible to me, even if you disregard all the physical world.
Well, sure, but that would still fit into my analogy here. So even if there's no physical things, it's just rational argument, some kind of idealistic consciousness world. When an argument is presented to the brain will either go from a state of no choice made to a state of choice made, or it will remain agnostic, essentially. And if the state change was caused by the reason, if the reason was 100% compelling, so if they're presented with the reason, they have no option to go but to go from a state of no choice to choice made, then it's determined, 100% determined. They have no choice over it. When they're just hit with this reason, they're just forcibly compelled to change their position. Determined, they have no choice. And the other option is they're hit with a reason and there's no causal process there, and either randomly they switch because there's nothing there, they just randomly quantum fluctuation switch in the spirit world or whatever. And those are the only two options. There isn't a third option there. Either when these brains are presented with reasons, the only two ways they can go from a state of no choice to choice is being determined or being random. There isn't a third option. There's no way to choose to adhere to the rationality or whatever. There's no way to use causa sui internal spiritual stuff to go from a state of no choice made to choice made. The only logically possible ways to go to make that state change is either it's determined by the reasons, or it's random, or a combination of both. And that is the full extent of the things that can potentially cause that state change. There isn't another thing that can cause that state change, because anything you add is going to fall into that category of is determined by prior things or is underdetermined and is random.
So I suppose perhaps we could just say a few more points on this free will kind of aspect. But I suppose the question would be, I'm not sure whether your argument would apply to, I guess, a mind looking purely at arguments in front of them. I get your point completely that you say, well, all right, they have reasons. If they have reasons, therefore they're determined. But would you not then say that the following of reasons, the idea of determined is a bit different? Like, you cannot use the word determined for someone's being moved by chemical process in their brain. It's not this. Yes, he's determined in the loosest form of the word, but it's a different type of determined than a mind looking at different arguments in front of them and then deciding to choose which one it is based on certain, perhaps intrinsic probabilities of certain things, or the how well they're being presented to them. Would you not say there are two different types of being determined, one being completely determined by, I guess, scientific causes, or just seeing arguments of different probabilities or plausibilities in front of you?
I don't think so, because either way they would be determined. So like if you're determined by like a rational argument that's just so compelling that it forces you to change your mind or whatever, or you're determined by chemical processes in your brain, either way, you have no control over those. And that's what the crux of the argument is if you don't have control over the ability to go from a state of no choice to a state of choice, then it's by definition not free. So if I'm like, there's this argument that if you knew God, you would necessarily have to follow him, that many Christians make. In which case I would have no choice. I would have no freedom, because if God presented himself to me, I would have to believe, because it's necessarily the case. Therefore, I lose my free will because I don't have any freedom over the option to believe. And so if reasons and rationality worked the same way, and you were presented with some arguments and they were just completely compelling to force you to change your position, it's not free. There's no free will there. There's no libertarian freedom. You're forced to change in the exact same way you'd be forced to change by sticking an electrode in a physical brain and setting your beliefs to whatever. And so either way, you lose libertarian freedom because it's determined by something else, something external to you, something that's not free, whether that be chemical reactions or a deterministic process of rationality. Either way, you lose freedom. And that's why I think libertarian free will is incoherent, because either it's going to be determined by these reasons, whether those reasons are physical or non-physical doesn't make a difference, or it's going to be random, or it's going to be some combination. And as far as I can tell, there's no logically coherent way to add a third option that doesn't fit into one of those two.
I perhaps the question here I would have for you is, if let's assume that someone has certain endorphins in their brain or dopamine in their brain, you could say, well, okay, they're determined to feel happy. I'm not a scientist, but let's assume that's the case. Now you have two people given the Kalam cosmological argument. I don't know whether it works or not. I like to think it works, but someone might think it doesn't work. You give two people the Kalam cosmological argument. One person may agree with it and then suddenly become a theist. Another person may not agree with it and then decide not to become a theist. It seems like the way the stimuli works in one of the ways of determining the output doesn't seem to work in the same way as it does on, I guess, the idea of a mind interacting with arguments and following their reasons. One person might give credence to the same thing and the other person may not, and then change your views based on it. Unlike if you just gave people dopamine, most of the time I would think they would feel happy.
I would probably not say that, because I would say that would only be the case if all brains were equally perfectly rational. So if all brains were equally perfectly rational and you presented a rational argument, it would be equally as compelling to all brains. Absolutely. But not all brains are equally rationally compelling. And so if our level of rationality is different, then the amount a rational argument will affect us will be different, proportional to how rational we are. In the same way that chemicals, like how sensitive we are to dopamine, will affect how happy we feel by what dopamine is released in our brain. So if we're very insensitive to dopamine, like if we have uh, alexithymia, we just won't feel very much of it. We can't feel pleasure. And so even if we have dopamine in our brain, we'll feel very little pleasure. Whereas if we have hypersensitivity to it, then we'll feel a lot of pleasure. Similarly to rationality, if we have hyper rational minds, they will be incredibly influenced by rational argument. But if we have very low level rational minds, they won't be affected at all, essentially. And so the same thing applies in either case. I don't really think the level of rationality would make a difference. The question is there a way to go from a state of no choice made to a state of choice made that isn't either determined or random? And in the case where you're only like partially rational or whatever, then it would just be random, because um, the lower level of rationality you have would essentially just mean you're less determined by the reasons, but it'd either be filled by some determined other feature, like you like it or it makes you happy or some other emotion, or it would just be random. And so that would still fit into the dichotomy of either it's determined or it's random.
Well, I suppose what most people, or at least I think what most theists that I've interacted with, define libertarian free will as is a mix of, I guess, the idea of being influenced by reasons. I don't think most of the theists say, oh, people just act randomly or without reason at all, and a mix of the acting on reason, given us a soul which looks upon those different arguments in front of them and makes a decision based on all the evidence available. So I suppose I don't want to get drawn into this too long, because I guess we've been talking for 22 minutes, and I guess I want to kind of move on to the discussion to talk about that external problem of evil in a bit. And perhaps I just want to just kind of touch upon this in regards to the logical problem of evil, assuming that free will exists, which I'm not saying you do believe that, but assuming it exists, do you think the free will defense would be a sufficient response to the logical problem of evil, or do you think it wouldn't be a sufficient kind of defeater of the logical problem of evil?
Well, just to say one last thing on that,
Yeah, go ahead.
I think a lot of the academic papers on this miss the point and don't address the atheist position, because the atheist position is more addressing how you go from a state of choice to no choice made to choice made, and whether or not you can use reasons as a justification to help motivate you is just irrelevant. And so I would like to see more papers from the theist side actually address the Steelman version of the argument, which is the transition from choice made to, or no choice made to choice made. How does that occur in a third way? But to answer your question about the logical problem of evil, so the logical problem of evil is that a perfectly good God couldn't exist. It's logically impossible, because if he was perfectly good and all powerful, he would not create any gratuitous suffering. And then the free will defense, or Plantinga's argument, is that there could be some sufficiently justified reason to allow for evil or gratuitous suffering, that like it would create a greater good or something along those lines.
Yes.
And so the free will defense is just an example of what this could be. And so my counter to that, why I think the logical problem of evil works, is that there's always a logical possibility that for any given reason, like free will, that thing can be achieved without the suffering. And so just like you can say it's logically possible that there may be some sufficient reason to allow for suffering, it's also logically possible to achieve that reason without the suffering, in which case that would support the logical problem of evil, because if there's a logical possibility to achieve free will without suffering, and God chose to do not that and keep the suffering, he would be either not all good or not all powerful.
I think you've presented the logical problem of evil quite well there, and I think that's a definition we could work off. Though I guess the question which would arise there is the use of logical possible or logically impossible, because you say logically possible that God could create that good without having the suffering, but also it is logically possible, if I get it right, that cause whatever is could also exist leading to that suffering as well. Now, if you say the first one is logically possible, and that God's nature, and this is what Mackie would say, is that a good thing removes all evil in any possible case that it has ability to remove it, that to make the explicit contradiction between the terms of evil, God's goodness, and God's all-knowing, what would be said is then that it should not, I guess, to steelman your position further, it's not only that it's logically possible for God to create that a world in which that good exists, but also the evil doesn't exist. That possibility would entail the logical impossibility of that possible good existing with the evil as well. So I guess that would be the steelman of your version to say, well, okay, the logical problem of evil works. Am I right in classifying that?
Yes, yes. So you're correct that in order to support the free will defense or any other defense, you'd have to prove it's logically impossible for the good to exist without the evil.
Because I think the challenge there then would arise as well. What's the difference between logical possibility and logical enforceability? Because there's a distinction, I suppose. If one said, okay, let's grant libertarian free will, for example. I know you don't believe that's coherent, but let's grant that for the case of the argument. One could say, well, is logically possible for a world where everyone does good and doesn't do evil, they choose good things all the time. That seems like a logically possible world, and I would agree that that's a logically possible world. But one could make the argument that that's not a logically enforceable world, such that if God created a world in which there's free creatures, although it's possible that they only do good, based on the fact that libertarian free will is the idea that people can act freely without any antecedent conditions, God cannot control whether they would actually do good or evil in that world. So given the prior state of affairs, there's no control about whether they would choose good or not. So the prior state of affairs of a world in which there's libertarian freedom, who only do good, and the prior state of affairs where there's libertarian freedom and people do good and bad, would be the same prior state of affairs, and there's no control between the two.
All right. So I would clarify and say there is both a logically possible worlds that are unenforceable and logically possible worlds that are enforceable, that all can attain the good without the suffering. And so if you want to be more specific, you'd have to show that it's logically impossible to have a both logically possible and logically enforceable world with the good without the suffering.
But would you not say that you only need to show that there is one possible world where, or at least there's that world which you're trying to describe, which is logically unenforceable, and although logically possible, is logically unenforceable?
Well, no, because a God who is omnipotent, who can do all logically possible things, if a single logical possibility exists where you can have the good without the suffering in a logically possible, logically enforceable way, and he chose not to do that, even though there is a logically possible world where they are entailed, he would still be evil because he can do all logically possible things.
But I would argue that the idea of omnipotence is to do logically possible things, but that does not entail logically unenforceable things, because I guess it depends on what.
Right, I 100% agree. So again, my argument here is that it's both logically possible and logically enforceable. So it has to be both logically possible and logically enforceable and have good without suffering. And you would have to show that those four criteria are logically impossible to coexist in a world. So we can just grant that it has to be logically enforceable as one of the necessary qualities, and I'm happy to do that. And so if your argument is that the free will or there is some sufficient good to allow for evil, you would have to show that it's logically impossible for there to be a world where you can have the good without the evil in a logically possible, logically enforceable way.
But I would say that it's possible to have a logically possible world where there exists there's only good, but I would say that that world is not logically enforceable. So there's a symmetry breaker between logical enforceability and logical possibility.
Right. So I'm granting
But
that
if
all
if we
roses
grant
are
that,
flowers, not all flowers are roses. So I'm granting that, and I'm saying you still have to show there is a not. It's impossible to have a logically enforceable world with the good, but without the suffering. You have to logically show that that's logically impossible.
to show that it's impossible to have a world with the good. Can you please repeat that one more time?
Yes. So you have the good, which free will or whatever, without the evil in a logically enforceable way, which also entails it's logically possible.
Yes, but I would argue that there is no way to enforce a world in which there's free will without evil. It's impossible to enforce in that world that everyone does good, because that would defeat the purpose of free will. Like it would be that internal definition of free will.
So that seems very easy to defeat. I've argued this with a number of philosophers. You can have a world where everyone has the rights to believe or think whatever they want. So you could call it a sin, like adultery, whatever. I wouldn't care. But they couldn't kill anybody else. Physically impossible. Everyone has personal force fields, or like my best of all possible worlds, where it's impossible to force anyone to do anything they don't consent to doing. You can have all the desires, whether you call them good or bad, that you want, but it's impossible to physically harm another human without consent. In which case, here is a logically possible world without any gratuitous suffering, that everyone has free will and it's enforceable.
But would you not say that the good of free will, at least according to the theist, is that one can make morally significant choices? One would not be making morally significant choices if all their free will is just acting in a brain in a vat. They wouldn't be able to carry out any morally significant choices in that perspective.
Well, that would seem to be self-defeating to the Christian worldview, because was it something like Jesus said something, if you look at another woman in lust, you're committing an adultery or whatever. And those things you can still do in this world. So you can still do evil or have morally significant choices that would go against the morality of Christianity. You just can't do all of them, which is fine. Like, we can't do all of them right now. Like, I don't have access to nuclear weapons. I don't have the option to choose not to nuke a country. Or Stephen Hawking, paraplegic. He didn't have arms or legs. He couldn't choose to physically harm someone. Does that mean he doesn't have free will? Well, no. The fact that you have the freedom to do all moral actions isn't entailed in morality. You don't need to be able to do all moral or immoral actions. And so you can still have the ability to do many morally significant actions, as defined in the Bible, like thought crimes or whatever, without the ability to do anything, force anyone to do anything they don't consent to doing. In which case, here is a logically enforceable world where everyone has free will and no one can rape or murder or steal without consent.
I would disagree with that, but I don't think that disagreement is necessarily important for our discussion here. But what I would argue is that that even if one grants that as a logically possible world, there is another logically possible world. Because what my argument is purely that there is one possible world in which you have a God which exists. You have free human creatures. Those free human creatures decide to do evil. That seems completely logically possible to me, as long as you accept the idea of libertarian free will.
Sure.
I mean, that doesn't seem logically impossible.
Yes, that's true, but that isn't the ultimate question, because the logical possibility of such a world existing is only true if God, an omnipotent God, didn't have another world to choose from. If there's another logically possible world that has the good and no evil, and he didn't do that, then that would be in conflict logically with being perfectly good, because perfectly good being is presumably going to pick the best logically possible, logically enforceable world, with the most morality, least morality, or least immorality, or whatever. And if he chose one that didn't have the maximum possible morality and freedom, or whatever the positive is, then he would be by definition immoral. So, like, if I could choose to save you by cutting your leg off, or I could choose to save you by giving you a shot of an antibacterial, cutting your leg off is immoral. I would be convicted of a crime, malpractice, because I chose a method to cure you that was more harmful than the maximum possible method. So if a God is omnipotent and can do all logically possible things, and there is one logically possible world that is better than a logically possible world that you're describing, and he didn't choose that, he would be by definition immoral.
But I would say in response to that the argument you make is, it's in some sense it's almost an unknowable argument. I'm not trying to do appeal to ignorance here, but I do think there is a perspective where I guess a world where thought crimes are. I mean, the exact currency or the way in which you figure out what crimes are worse than others from a human perspective, or at least a human perspective, might seem to be worse or might seem to be better. But if you look at a world with thought crimes, who knows how much more thought crimes or less thought crimes could exist in that world. And I think in some sense you get a world of just a complete comparison between different counterfactuals, where no one really understands actually how to measure those counterfactuals or in between, distinguish between those counterfactuals, if you got what my argument is.
Well, that's true of any moral argument, because we haven't solved objective morality, so we don't have a way to measure which model or which world is more moral. It's just a kind of an assertion. And so we essentially have to use our moral intuitions and say, well, if God could have created the world I'm describing, where it's impossible for anyone, including God, to force anyone else to do anything they don't consent to doing, and they can still have free will, but he didn't create that world, then was that moral? And the answer typically that most moral intuitions give is no, that would be immoral. If he could have done that but didn't, he's probably bad. And so that's essentially how we assess the moral significance of things, by using moral intuitions. And that's all we have in morality, because there isn't really anything else. So you can beg the question and say, well, my model of morality says anything I do is right, or anything my God does is right. But that's just begging the question. There's no real evidence of that. And so in order to provide evidence, you have to try to match it to moral intuitions. And what do our moral intuitions say? Well, they say a world that I'm describing would be a far more moral world than the one we currently live in, and it's logically possible, and it's enforceable. So it's met all the criteria that you've presented. The only way to counter that argument is to say, but my own definition of morality based on my own holy book, which we don't have any evidence for, says morality is fine. And then I would, of course, go for the drowning babies argument, the Jesus drowned babies. And so that's probably not a good basis of morality.
Where do you get the Jesus drowned babies for? Before we carry on,
Genesis 1:12. Are you a Trinitarian?
Yes.
So God is fully Jesus, Jesus is fully God, and the Holy Spirit, they're all like one essence, three persons or something?
Yes.
So anything God does, Jesus does, Holy Spirit does?
Pardon?
So anything that God does, Jesus
yes,
does or consents to it. So God drowned the world, Genesis 1:12, flooded, killed millions of people.
Well, there's numerous ways people look at it, and some people don't view it literally, but that's beyond the debate. And I'm not throwing it away just for the sake of throwing it away, but I think there's a lot on the problem of evil that we can discuss. So I kind of want to move through it, if you got what I mean.
Yeah.
But,
So just,
no.
but
Yeah, I
God drowned the world. There were babies on the world at the time.
Yeah.
God drowned babies. Jesus therefore drowned babies.
No, though I mean, on that point, it does raise a similar question of whether God exists in the same moral community as us, and that's something that a few scholars have questioned about in the past. Like, well, okay, we talk about each other humans as morally, I guess, morally, we're judged by the same moral terms. How do we turn to God for that? And when we talk about the external problem of evil, I actually make the argument that God's completely not part of a moral community in some sense. So I mean, that's something we could discuss in a bit, and we can delve into the argument later on. But I suppose tying back to just the logical problem of evil before we turn to the evidential or the external problem of evil, I do think there still is that argument of I guess you could say, well, we have these moral intuitions about which ones are better or which ones are worse. And I agree, moral intuitions do play a massive role in philosophy. And that's a valid argument to make. Though based on that, I would not say that moral intuitions are strong enough to then make a claim of what is morally possible to be betterly, well, what is better to be enforced or what's worse to be enforced, in the same way that it's not a conclusive argument against anything. And I grant you could say, well, most people intuit that certain world's better than the other, but to me, at least based on my moral intuitions, which don't need to be your moral intuitions, it seems to me that someone can make morally significant choices in relationship to other people and in relationship to themselves. For example, you say thought crimes, right? Thought sins. I would say that thought sins are thought sins because there actually is someone else out there who you actually are thinking about in a brain. In fact, there is no thought sin of another person out there. It's just kind of a image which is imposed on their brain. And the argument could go along those lines. So I would argue that moral intuitions in some sense don't lead to the modal strength of logical impossibility for your hypothesis to be definitively better than mine, I suppose.
Sorry, I lost you on the brain in the vat, because in mine there's no brain in the vat. Everyone is exactly as real as they are today. It's just physically impossible for me to harm you if you don't consent. And so you're still there. You're still just as real as you are now. The only difference is like if I tried to stab you or something, I'd pass through you like a ghost. And so you're still exactly a real person. And all of the thought crimes would be equally as real or relevant or morally significant as they would in this world. There would be essentially no difference. The only difference would be that forcing you or physically harming you without your consent would just be impossible. And so there would be an exact one-to-one parallel to all the thought crime things.
I mean, I think in that world, I would view that world as a morally inferior world than the world we live in. But that's just my moral intuitions, and I know I'm happy to just leave it at there. Or if you want to continue talking about that, we can. But I think there's just a lot to continue discussing. But we can go down that route if you want.
Sure, I would just say that seems arbitrary. Like if I just said what Hitler did was fine because of my moral intuitions, that would be an equivalently justified argument as what you seem to be making. It doesn't seem to be any justification or any kind of rationality behind it. It just seems like, oh, I prefer this one, which is a minority view that seems to go against everyone else's intuition, and go against a lot of moral philosophers' arguments about what is good. Pretty much every model of morality would go against that. Utilitarianism, consequentialism, pretty much every version of deontology, value ethics. Like there's essentially no model that would agree except for yours. Yours is the only one that shares any kind of commonality with that version being better. And so it seems like cherry picking to try to find such a hyper specific model that only works in this one case, that doesn't have any analogies to any of the other predominant models that are the consensus in the field. And so I would say that's a very weak argument from my perspective. Like someone who said climate change was fake. It goes against all the evidence. Like, yes. Okay, I mean, you could say that, but
yes. No, though I do think I'll just say something and you could decide to respond to it or not. I think under a possible world where people actually are able to act based on their decisions and make their, I guess you say, well, someone would stab someone and their knife would go right past them. I would argue that someone stabbing someone has the intention to actually stab them, and that would actually have an impact. Probably is one of the reasons for why they would decide to stab someone in the first place. I think in some sense, a world in which one cannot carry out their repercussions in some sense would not be a kind of a coherent world for that idea of acting, and the idea of not acting, that decision making would impact the choices in which goes into their mind when they're deciding what to do or not. And also on the idea of, okay, well, different moral hypothesis, deontology, and consequentialism, one could argue that, I guess, under a theistic worldview, there is always that view of heaven and an afterlife afterwards. So I don't think the consequentialist argument necessarily holds, or saying this is not suitable or would be against consequentialism doesn't seem to hold for me. Now, we don't need to grant heaven or an afterlife or whatever it is. But if it is possible in this world, and I suppose we're still talking about the logical problem of evil here, as long as it's possible for there to be an afterlife in that sense, the consequentialist argument kind of goes out to the roof because of that possibility for future pleasure, which would then outbalance every consequentialist view of pain. Now, I'm not saying that's the correct view or that's the view I hold, but I'm just saying it's a possible solution.
Well, I disagree with that really quick, because in my best of all possible worlds, that would be equally as good as heaven or better. Minimum requirement is it must necessarily be as good, because you can do anything you consent to doing. So anything that's possible in heaven would be possible in my best of all possible worlds. And so it would be at minimum equally as good. So the consequentialist would default to my view, because you don't have to go through all this pain and suffering here to get to there. You just start there. But that's a separate argument. The first thing you said was, what was it? You say it's incoherent to have the desire to stab someone if you don't have the ability to stab someone, or something along those lines.
Not incoherent, but implausible.
Right. Have you heard of paraplegics?
Can you explain them to me?
Paraplegics, someone who can't move their arms or legs. Their backs are broken.
Yes.
They can't stab anybody. They
Yes.
literally lack the ability to stab people, but they can still think about it. Do they have less moral significance to anybody else? Do they have less free will?
I don't think so. No.
So then that would seem to be a defeater for your claim that it's incoherent, because there is your example right there that it actually exists. And I can go the other way too. I don't have the ability to nuke people. I don't have any nukes. Does that make my decisions less morally significant because I don't have the options to nuke people?
No, but what I am arguing is that there is a difference between actually carrying out one's actions within one physical realm, because the paraplegic would have their realm of morally possible actions. I have my realm of morally possible actions. We all have different ideas of morally possible, what we can do, and that morality would thus be judged based on those things. And I guess my view of things is that God would judge us based according to how we act, the responses of how we act, how we interact with certain circumstances. A person in Africa would be judged for the different things than where I am today, the same way he would judge you in a different way he judges me. And I think that idea of a moral diversity is potentially a higher good. Now, I'm just speaking this completely out of my ass here. I'm just kind of making things up as I go. But I do think that at least seems to me to be potentially a morally diverse world is a better world than one in which everyone just can purely commit thought crimes. And I'm not arguing whether this is plausible or whatnot, but I do think it's at least possible. And intuitively, there seems to be reason behind that hypothesis, I suppose.
Well, that's why I'm using the argument of the nukes, because I can think of a more diverse world. Like if everyone had the option to nuke somebody, that would be a more morally diverse world. We would have more diversity in the moral significance of our actions than we have now. Does that make it better?
But I argue that morally diverse, I'm not defining that as everyone has more options, but rather that everyone has different circumstances, and there's different challenges and different stories going on.
We could still have that in my best of all possible worlds. Like that's still a thing. But
then some people can't do certain things, and if they try to do certain things, they can't actually do it because that would then hinder other people's freedoms and whatnot. It seems way more constrained under that possibility.
Well, again, how is that different from the paraplegic?
Well, I'm arguing that the paraplegic has his own moral circumstances, and someone else has another circumstance who can actually do things, and that diversity between their moral, what they can possibly do, is different, and therefore creates a landscape of different diverse situations. Whereas in the case of the previous case of everyone trying to stab people, knives goes through people, whatnot, that's less of a moral diverse world than the world I'm describing.
Right. So in my world, I probably haven't described this to you before. As I said, you can't do anything to people that they don't consent to, which means if they consent to be in a world that's exactly like this one, you can do all of the harms that you can do in this world. So the moral diversity is, again, 1-to-1. You can do anything in the best of all possible worlds that you can do in this world if people just consent to live in a world that has those rules. So there's no limitation on stabbing people. It's only you can't stab people who don't consent or don't consent to be in a world that allows stabbing. So all of the actions that are possible in this world are possible in the best of all possible worlds that I'm describing. And so there would be no limitation there. There would be a 1-to-1 correlation. So the diversity would be equal or greater, because in that world you can have nukes. So everyone could have nukes potentially, and so there'd be a greater diversity of different possibilities of what people can and can't do. And so by your own definition, I think that would make my world better, because there's a greater diversity of possible actions that people can do.
Well, I would argue that, I guess to me at least intuitively, there is this intrinsic beauty of having the ability to both do good and do harm in relationship to other people. And I guess this is my Heideggerian side speaking. There's this interesting nature of which this idea of being thrown into the world is itself a morally and existentially significant idea to what we conceive of being humans. Though I have to say that's just me speaking. People could disagree with that. But as we discussed previously, it's just moral intuitions, I guess, at that perspective. And there are people supporting my intuitions. There's some people supporting your intuitions. And, I think, at least to me, I'm quite happy with leaving the debate here. But if you want to carry going down that path, feel free.
Well, yeah, so I agree with the first part that
Hmm.
having the freedom to choose to do good or bad is a good. And so every conscious agent would have the freedom to choose to live in a world exactly like this one, with all of the constraints of this one. Rape, murder, all those things are possible. And so the only difference between these two worlds is that the only people who would live there would be the ones who consent to live there and not the ones who don't, which seems to be a moral good to have that additional property rather than the second thing you said, which is forcing people to live in a world like this. That I would think is horribly immoral, actually. If you don't consent to live in a world with these kinds of constraints, forcing someone to be there would be immoral. It would be bad to force someone to be in a world they don't consent to be in or with rules they don't consent to be in. And so while I agree with the first one, and my world accounts for that and says everyone has the possibility to do anything that they consent to. So you can have nukes, you can have rape and murder and torture and stabbing if you consent to be in one of those possible worlds where that is allowed. You can go there. And if you don't, you don't go there. And that seems to be a morally superior world than one where everyone's forced to go into the stabby world without their consent.
Hmm. I suppose we just disagree on that because I have like this existential view of humanity where people being thrown into the world is part of what it means to be human as well. But that's just I guess my Heideggerian approach, and you evidently disagree with it. Let's see how that goes. And I think it's an interesting perspective that you do. So I guess before we move on to the existential or the external problem of evil, I just have a quick question: is when you're talking about this best of all possible worlds, are you talking that under the lens of, I guess we've been talking about, let's assume free will exists, or is that a possible world under which you previously discussed from a physicalistic perspective or deterministic perspective that there is no free will at all? Like, is this just playing ex hypothesi with the hypothesis that we've been discussing, or is that generally the best possible worlds in as a good?
Well, so my model is independent of whether or not there's free will. I wrote my own model of morality. The conclusion is the best of all possible worlds is a world where it's impossible to force any conscious agent to do anything it doesn't consent to doing. And that would be true whether or not there was free will. So if there's no free will, you'd have the same criteria. If there is free will, you'd have the same criteria. And so it would be independent of whether or not we have free will.
Would you not say the word consent? I'm just asking this as perhaps a closing question on this, but we'll go on more. But would you say consent is itself a conception of which kind of requires free will? For someone to
No.
consent to something, they have to believe in, they have some freedom to consent to it or not. Because otherwise,
No,
how
not
is someone
unless
choose
you're
one word
using
or
like
the
some
other?
kind of compatibilist definition of free will. And if you want to use a compatibilist definition where free will is compatible with determinism, sure. But I would agree with the consensus of philosophers that there is no libertarian free will. I think like the amount that agreed to libertarian was like single digits or like in the teens or something very, very small. No one really thinks free will is a coherent thing in philosophy. But they do grant compatibilist free will, which it's just determinism with a different name, which is I'm fine with. So I really doesn't make a difference to my argument whether or not there's free will. All that matters is the the morality of the world is that you can't force people to do things they don't consent to, whether you define consent as compatibilist or as determinist or as libertarian doesn't make a difference to the argument.
Then what goes on between the choice of, or at least, or this movement between going into the best possible worlds, a world in which people have morally, I don't say morally significant action because that would be kind of my definition of it, but the act where people are knives are passing through or knives not passing through, what goes into that? Is that just purely determined or is just kind of random?
The choices
Yes.
or yeah. So the
The choice
choices
of going
would
to which
be
world.
fine to have them be determined. So in the compatibilist view, your brain acting as it would without external influences is what the definition of free will is, more or less. And so like I like chocolate ice cream, and so in the best of all possible worlds, I could just snap my fingers and generate chocolate ice cream. I don't like being stabbed, so it would be impossible for me to be stabbed. Whether or not I like those things for free will reasons or determined reasons doesn't make a difference to the argument. The morality is simply the desire fulfillment of those things that I consent to versus things I don't consent to.
Interesting. But perhaps we could turn to the external problem of evil. And
Sure.
this was something we've discussed previously. How I guess the question, or at least it seemed to me, is that in relationship to the problem of evil, your biggest challenge was, I guess, there's a conception of God that you have, a conception of evil which you have, and then therefore and a conception of good, and God's not actualizing the world in which there's most good, therefore God does not exist. And you define the definition of God as all good, all knowing, and all powerful, and whatnot, and then evil as I guess what that which imposes on other people's will or people's choices, and then good as your own people being able to act based on their own choices.
Yeah, assisting people's wills would be morality.
Assisting people's wills.
Yeah.
So is therefore moral good to assist other people's wills, but also one's. Would that? How does that work within relationship to oneself? So there's one person there is just purely his own will being assisted, I suppose, would be the most moral.
Well, that wouldn't be morality. Morality is specifically helping someone else's will. So if let's say we were working on a video game together and it was really hard and you wanted help and I helped you to beat the video game, that would be moral because you were trying to do something. Or say you wanted ice cream and I got you ice cream, that would be moral. And so in this world, the best of all possible worlds, you could just get it yourself. That's a possibility, but you can also limit yourself such that you need help and assistance, in which case other people can help you and work together in joint worlds to do things. And you could still have all the moral actions.
What if someone says, you have this evil person who wills certain evils, like the Holocaust, right? Hitler wills the Holocaust. And then does that world then would require people who are willingly to undergo the Holocaust for the Holocaust to happen? Because I suppose when they want to exterminate the Jews, they're like, well, I will it such that these people are getting exterminated, but then it's also a further good for people to actually be exterminated. So it would
only be possible if they consented to it. So if there was a bunch of people who consented to being exterminated in the Holocaust, then they could be moral and help Hitler to achieve his goals and say, I will sacrifice myself in order to help him achieve his goals. And that would be a moral thing to do. It would be moral to sacrifice yourself to help someone else achieve their desires. That's true. I don't think many people are going to do it, but they could.
But I suppose that's an interesting thing, because I guess when you think about you're viewing as the wills, do you think that, I guess, Hitler would not only want to have the feeling of exterminating these people, or would it also be a case where he actually wants people to be exterminated, given the fact that they are people being exterminated, not just some fantasisms, I'm throwing these phantoms into a gas chamber, they're getting gas, but they don't actually die there. There seems to be a point where in your best of all possible world, a god would then have to actually create things to actually get perished in that situation. Because a true sadist would actually want his sadism to actually occur and not just, I guess, continuously stab people, but the knife will not go through them.
Oh, sure. But again, the moral principle in this world is you can never force anyone to do anything they don't consent to doing. And so no conscious agent could ever be forced to be gassed. They would all have to consent to it. And so not all actions are possible in this world. So you couldn't force anyone else to be gassed. If they don't consent to it, you can't do it. And that's okay. It's okay that you don't get all of your desires fulfilled.
But then would a god, I guess, in this world, he must try to fulfill this best of all possible worlds, right? In under your external framework, he would find a possible world or a possible way in which this is configured such that there would be enough people to undergo that suffering or whatever it is, who are willing to undergo it, or in some way or another, everyone's wills would get completely fulfilled one way or another.
Oh, no. So the criterion for the best of all possible worlds is that everyone gets their own world, essentially, and no one can force anyone else to do what they don't consent to doing. There's no criterion of maximizing the consent. That's not a part of it. It's only the maximizing the freedom of imposition. So no one else can impose on you. That makes the best of all possible worlds. It's not about maximizing your values.
So you talked about everyone getting their own possible worlds. Then how does that separate from our previous discussion about there actually being other people interacting within one's own possible world?
Well, you can consent to go to a communal world where there's multiple people. You could consent to go to someone else's world and live under their rules. You could consent to go to the Christian world with the Christian God and do the Christian world things. So it's not that you're confined to your own world and cannot leave. It's you have the option to go to your own world like it's your home. And you then also have the option to consent to go to joint worlds or create worlds together with other people, or be subservient to a different entity in its world. So it's optional. It just becomes optional to go to other worlds and interact with other people.
That's an interesting view. I never thought about that before. It seems like quite a fun thing that my cousins play on Roblox, and they turn it on and they pop into different servers and whatnot. But no, Yeah, that's quite fascinating. But I guess the question then arises, and perhaps I would, I guess, present my own response to the problem of evil from an external perspective, and we could discuss that a bit purely from an external perspective, is to say, well, there is my argument kind of ties into what people call the anthropodicy, which is the idea that instead of starting off with God and evil and trying to explain how that works, we start off with humans and evil. And the way in which that goes on is to say, well, okay, we know that evil exists as humans. We know evil exists perhaps more than we know God exists. So let's start off with that and figure out, if one was to go down a theistic route, how exactly are we to understand how God is in light of the evil that exists? And personally, I would say God does not share the same moral community as us. So we are in some sense free to try to understand what God is, but at the same time, I'm a bit of a mystic myself, so I don't exactly say we have any positive predicates that we can say about God definitively. So God's omnipotence, God's omnibenevolence, whatnot, are purely expressions of what we try our best, humans' ability to try our best to understand what God is, but not exactly what God is. And therefore, we try to understand how we can relate to a God, which allows for the evil that exists in the world. And then we face, of course, challenges based on that. And I think that anti-theology is quite an interesting challenge about, is God moral for even allowing evil to exist, or is it even moral to create a theodicy? And I'll say let's not try to create a theodicy in the traditional sense, but rather that we know that humans have freedom. We know that evil exists. Humans should try to face evil in the best way possible. And God is a God which allows for that to exist. And let's figure out each individually how to wrestle with that existence of the God. And that's just my view of evil from an external perspective, not an internal one.
So what would be the value in approaching evil from this way of starting with it? So evil exists, humans exist, how do we interact with evil? What is the value in looking at evil from this perspective?
Well, I think the value for looking at evil in this perspective is its existential value, to challenge us about how we can respond to the suffering that we see in the world. And of course, there's a difference between suffering and evil, but I would like to think that when one is faced with evil or suffering of other people, we would be inclined to try to fight against it. And that, I guess, is a better step than starting off by saying, okay, we know God exists, we know evil exists, how can we qualify that? The first thing we should do is try to challenge that evil and try to move forward based on that, I guess.
Sure, I would agree 100%. I would think that that's what we do with science, essentially. It's we're trying to solve as many evils as possible.
Yes, no, I agree with that. But yes, and I do think, though, that what then creates is a more interesting perspective and dynamic, where people then have to look at this discussion about evil from a more existential landscape, because then evil doesn't become just this abstract philosophical concept that one has in the logical problem of evil or the evidential problem of evil, but rather something which is very real and very, very personal to each person, and everyone has to wrestle with evil in this existential aspect.
Sure, definitely, I would agree, and I think that it is important to recognize that evil is a real thing that people deal with, and we should try to solve the everyday evils that people suffer. And that should be the goal, I think, of humanity as a whole, is to solve those evils, to move us closer to what I would call the best of all possible worlds by eliminating all those evils. So for sure, I would agree with that aspect of what you're talking about.
Yes. No, and I guess that's why the external problem of evil is, I guess, a more interesting one, because I think most people can end up agreeing with each other on different perspectives, which I suppose perhaps we're doing right now. Is that, I guess, then based on that framework of God existence and evil, or at least humans existence and evil, then the external problem of evil, the person responding to it, might just say, well, all right, one's experience of evil dictates a world in which a God exists, and that's the best existentialist solution to the problems in front of them, which would, I suppose, under your scheme, would be similar to the person who chooses to go down or consents to go to the world in which the Christian God is true and whatnot. So that would seem to be, I guess, how the external problem of evil in my framework would tie on to the best possible world in your one, or at least there's some similarities between the two.
Maybe. So what exactly is the external problem of evil?
Well, it seemed to me when we were last discussing this, and it's been quite a while, but one of the conflicts we had was the external problem of evil, which was, I think you define good and evil in a certain way, which was incompatible with how you define God, and therefore, based on your perspective of how I define God, how I define good, and how I define evil, therefore you'll get one consistent set or one inconsistent set where God is incompatible with evil. And I think, if I remember correctly, that would be a disagreement. That would be an external problem, because you're saying, well, okay, these are my definitions of good, God, and evil. They are incompatible. So that's the external problem of evil.
Right. So it's external to Christianity, because
yes,
internal to
mm-hmm.
Christianity would be defined based off Christianity. Gotcha.
No, so I guess that was the biggest distinction between the two, is to say, well, okay, the internal problem is is Christianity internally consistent, and is Christianity coherent as a whole, as a way to explain evil, I guess, from an external perspective.
Right. Yeah, and I'm more interested in the external problem, because I think there is a model of objective morality that is true. And so we're trying to establish, is God moral based off of that objective morality, not looking at it from a circular reasoning perspective, starting with your conclusion, saying, well, God is perfectly moral. Is God moral based off of the perspective of the Bible, which is written by God? That would seem to be just circular, begging the question to start with your conclusion and try and answer it that way. It seems like it's more rational to start with from the external perspective and try to find an independent source or definition of morality that is consistent with like some kind of consilient body of evidence, like the all of the different models or whatever was the consensus in philosophy or whatever, and then try to work backwards to say, well, does a particular model cohere with the consilience of the body of evidence that we have, or is it only consistent with itself and doesn't cohere with the rest of the models of morality that humans have access to?
Yeah, I think there's definitely value to the external problem, and personally, I prefer interacting with the external problem more, partially because I don't think the internal problem is necessarily a very good argument, or the internal problem of evil works. I don't think it works. So I do think there's more kind of leeway and diversity within the external problem of evil. And in some sense, when we're getting towards the end of our discussion about the internal problem of evil, we're moving into the external problem of evil naturally. So I think that's generally the direction problem of evil should be going, is to say, well, we know evil exists. How can we face that? We know that a certain morality exists. Let's see how that works, and let's move towards that. And I think that's a more productive direction going forward for the problem of evil in general.
Sure.
Yeah. I don't have much more to discuss on this perspective. I think that I've talked about most of the things I wanted to talk about in relation to internal and external problem of evil. Is there anything else that you want to perhaps touch upon or talk about a bit more?
Not really. Do you have any super cute single women you could introduce me to? That'd be great. That'd be amazing.
Mate, if I knew the answer to that, I'll be perhaps we could do that for each other.
Yes, great.
If only.
Yeah. Oh, that's it for me. I'm gonna probably take a nap because I just did a bunch of work before, and now I have to do some more work.
Good luck with that, mate. Good luck. It's currently I think 10 p.m. at night over here, so I'll probably be heading to bed soon after a bit more work. But no, good luck with everything. I never knew you played chess, but maybe the next time we're talking, we'll be doing like a chess face off, and I'll be like hacking on my phone with some random like bot at the back, because my elo, I think, on Rapid was, last I checked, 1350 or something. So
that's pretty good. In one of the chess groups I go to at the U, there's a couple people who are like 200-300. I'm like, I didn't even know it goes that low. That's ridiculous.
Well, personal experience, the Dante's hell and the evidential problem of evil, you have to get lower and lower to find different levels of elo, I suppose. Moral possible worlds, mate. Morally possible worlds.
Well, thanks for coming on, and appreciate you spending the time to have a conversation with me. Really great talking with you as always. And if you ever need an atheist speaker to come down to Oxford to give lectures, I'm your guy.
Of course. I'll let people know.
For sure. All right. Thanks again, and I'll talk to you later.
Have a good one.